Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here in the overflow room with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, and we are here. We've arrived at number 45, the Farewell Symphony. Now, a few of the earlier ones have had nicknames and can claim a certain degree of popularity or familiarity with today's listeners. But this one, number 45, was the first Haydn symphony to achieve an independent and continuous existence from Haydn's day till ours. And I just look at my Haydn section, which is up here and up there and up there and down here and sort of here in the overflow room. And I've got lots of farewell symphonies in there because it's very, very popular. And it's popular because of a gimmick, not because of anything musical. Although the way that Haydn handles that gimmick, now that is what makes it such a work of genius. And we're going to be talking about that fairly extensively. What is the gimmick? Well, the gimmick obviously is the farewell bit. And I might as well give you the official story on the gimmick. Here's what happened. Well, Haydn's patron, Prince Nicholas Esterhazy, built Esterhazy, the Palace Esterhazy, in the middle of a Hungarian swamp. But it's quite beautiful. It's an imitation of Versailles. It's big. It had its own opera house and concert hall and, of course, all the military stuff and stables and things that you just had to have in those days. And the prince had his famous orchestra, which was led by Haydn, which had to be with him at all times when he was in residence in Esterhazy, so as to provide the necessary royal entertainment. Now, the prince spent, essentially, the summer holidays there. And those holidays tended to stretch out because he liked his incredibly expensive new palace. And so he tended to tarry. And the orchestral players were very annoyed with this because their wives and children were left behind at Eisenstadt, the other big palace that the Esterhazys hung out in, and that was in Vienna. So the rest of the family was in the city, and the menfolk were playing in the orchestra in the swamp. And this annoyed them considerably, as Prince Esterhazy showed no sign of wanting to go back, and they had no choice in the matter whatsoever. They were stuck there as long as he was there. So the story goes, they approached their Kapellmeister, who was Haydn, the leader of the prince's musical establishment, and said to him, "Oh, please, help, get us out of this shithole. We want to go home." So Haydn agreed, and he wrote the Farewell Symphony. And what happens in the Farewell Symphony is that at the end of the finale, the instruments very slowly do little solos, and then they blow out their candles, because remember, they played standing up, and they had a little candle in front of their music so they could see what they were doing, and hopefully it didn't catch fire or drip hot wax on their toes or anything like that. They were in livery, they were in formal attire, and they would do their little solo and bow and leave, until at the very end of the Farewell Symphony, the only people left were two muted solo violins. Haydn played one, and his concertmaster Luigi Tommasini played the other. And the Farewell Symphony is one of the reasons we know, by the way, that Haydn symphonies did not require keyboard continuo performance, because it is the only symphony where Haydn bothers to write down instruments that aren't normally indicated at all, such as the bassoon, where he actually writes a solo line for a bassoon, which he never mentions anywhere else. And there is no solo line for the harpsichord continuo, for the cembalo part, and Haydn, who would normally have played it, was playing the violin. So there's a very, very good argument to be made that Haydn symphonies should not be played with the non-existent continuo harpsichord extra part that so many early performances add, which I think sort of does not help the music. That's one thing about the Farewell Symphony that makes it wonderful. But of course, the whole thing is wonderful, because in order to portray this entire gimmick, this whole stunt, which worked, by the way, the prince theoretically got the point and said to the establishment, okay, guys, let's go. And of course, the story goes they packed up and left the next day, which, if you know anything about the way royalty traveled in those days, was not going to happen the next day. No way in a million years could it happen the next day. It probably took them a week to pack. You had trunks and trunks and trunks of stuff that they had to schlep back and forth by horses and carriage. The logistics of a move like that really took a certain amount of planning. But apparently word went out that they were going back to Vienna, and so it worked. And that story had kept the symphony alive, even past the point where people understood anything about what it was doing musically, because what it does musically is just amazing. This is the height of Haydn's Sturm und Drang period, the storm and stress, hysterical, minor key, heightened emotional expression type thing. And what makes the farewell so remarkable is that not only is it emotionally incredibly touching, I mean, it really is. There's something hauntingly beautiful and sweet and just beyond charming. I mean, sublime about the whole thing. It's the fact that it's a joke. It's Haydn. Who are we dealing with? It's a joke. The whole farewell thing is a joke. It's very funny, but it's funny in the most serious possible way. Haydn executes the humor in a way which is incredibly touching. It really is. And that's one of the most wonderful things about it. It's that delicious ambiguity in the music. Is it happy? Is it sad? It's funny, but it's also serious. He's also saying something with his humor. And that was something completely and entirely new in music. And that's even more important, quite frankly, than the fact that it's mostly in a minor key and full of storm and stress and angst and that kind of stuff. It's the fact that the musical expression has entered a whole new world of ambiguousness. And that ambiguity is so human. It's so far beyond, happy, sad, happy, sad. No, it's everything. And that's what it really is. It's bittersweet. It's nostalgic. It's got shades and nuances of expressive meaning that music had never attempted before. And Haydn realizes it all so brilliantly. And we're going to hear a lot of this symphony. I mean, there's so much you could talk about, but I'm going to try and boil it down to some essential points and play as much music as I can so that we can just get right to it. Now, the first movement of the symphony, which is scored for 2 oboes, 2 horns, and strings, that's it, plus a bassoon, which Haydn only mentions in the finale when it has its own little musical line because it has to leave, it is incredibly intense. The key that it's written in is F sharp minor, and it is the only symphony in F sharp minor written in the entire 18th century. And the entire 19th century. In fact, it may have been the only symphony in F sharp minor until we get to things like, I think Mahler's 10th was sort of kind of in F sharp minor, and Korngold's symphony is in F sharp minor. I mean, it's so rare, it's almost unheard of. And Haydn's is clearly the most famous example. But this key means something. And we can talk about this when I get to F sharp minor in our talks about emotions, keys and their emotional expression, because F sharp minor, the F keys in the minor, that is F minor and F sharp minor both, meant something very special to Haydn. They were his personal minor keys. Some composers have personal minor keys. Mozart used G minor, Beethoven used C minor to express certain emotional states. I mean, whether or not the keys did it or not doesn't matter. What matters is that the composers associated those keys with certain consistent expressions of emotion. And in Haydn, F minor and F sharp minor always represent, where we have music with text or we have other examples, farewell, abandonment, desolation, loneliness. This is Haydn's key that means that. And there are tons of examples throughout his work where in vocal music particularly, where a singer talks about being abandoned like in his Scena di Berenice, for example, or parts of his Stabat Mater, where they talk about those feelings, he's in F minor or F sharp minor. And it's a remarkable thing. It really, really is. And this symphony is a whole symphony that does it, which is incredibly cool. And it gives us a real key to some of what Haydn's music expresses. Now, this first movement is incredibly remarkable, and it has been often remarked just how remarkable it was. In fact, this symphony is so incredible that it was the subject of an entire book by a noted Haydn scholar. I mean, it was the farewell symphony and like the expression of classical everything or something like that. Really a big deal. I have the book. It's very, very interesting, by the way. The first movement is intensely monothematic. In other words, it's all based on the opening idea, which is a syncopated rhythm. That's chop, 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 like that. Chop, 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 like this is sort of syncopated rhythm off the beat. And then a tune, which is just a downward arpeggio in 3 phases. Yam bum 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 ba dum bum bum. Ya bum 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 ba dum bum ba. Ya bum bum. It does that 3 times. And just remember that. Just remember that it does that 3 times. That's really all you'll need to know to hear the most important thing about the movement, the most fascinating thing about the movement. And that theme is so concentrated and furious and intense, and it never lets up. Here it is. Yeah, powerful, isn't it? It really is. It's very, very full of tension, incredible tension. This whole movement is just a dynamo of tension. Now, normally in sonata form movements, you have a first subject, and then you have a second subject, which would be, in this case, in the relative major of F sharp minor, which is A major, I think, or something like that. But that's which key it would be doesn't really make any difference. The point is, there is no second subject here where you expect it to be. What happens instead is that the movement the music just keeps churning on and churning on and churning on with endless variants of that initial idea until suddenly, in the middle of what purports to be the development section, that is the middle section, the music comes to a dead halt, and this seemingly completely unrelated tune pops in. And that, a lot of analysts say, is really the second subject, except it doesn't show up until the development. It's not in the usual place, which is in what we would call the exposition, the presentation of the initial themes of the movement. Now, I don't think that that's terribly helpful, frankly, as a point of analysis, because, I mean, it is where it is. It's in the middle of the development section, and it seems to be completely unrelated to what's come before. It's wistful, it's in a major key, it seems somehow a little bit distracted, like it woke up somewhere and didn't know where it was, and that plays for a little bit, and then it stops completely dead, and pow, the music takes off again right from the beginning in terms of the recapitulation. But it doesn't really recapitulate in the traditional sense either. It just keeps going. It just keeps developing its ideas until it stops, rather abruptly, actually. And so the point I want to make about this unbelievably weird interruption is that theme, that wonderful theme that seems completely unrelated, is really a variant of the opening of the whole symphony. How do we know it's a variant? Well, remember I told you the opening consists of 3 phrases, all of which descend, and they sort of descend in a rising wave, more or less. It's da, 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 da. You heard it. Da, 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 like that. Well, this slow theme, this beautiful theoretical second subject, does exactly the same thing. It's 3 phrases initially descending, and here it is. Let me just play it for you. Think about the 3 phrases that you hear in sort of ascending order, but they all go this way, downwards, and you'll hear the resemblance immediately. So that's that middle interlude. And you'll notice I gave you a little bit of what happens on either side of it. So you can hear just how remarkable it is that it just pops up out of nowhere. Haydn is deliberately writing something that is as different as possible from what has gone before and what comes after, yet related to it. And that's what's so fascinating. And from this, one of the things we learn is that an idea in music, as I've said so many times, is not necessarily a tune. It can be a shape. It can be the way a tune is structured. And in this case, the tune does have a certain relationship in terms of its descending phrases, but it is also related because it consists of three separate thingies, three separate thematic modules, whatever you want to call them, phrases, modules, sentences, clauses. It doesn't make any difference. The point is there are three of them, and they are audibly related to the opening three of them, and that's the point. So I'm going to play you now the entire first movement on this very fine Naxos recording with the Capella Istropolitana under Barry Wordsworth, and just let the movement go and realize just how astonishing it is in its sequence of moods. Here we go. Yeah. Now, that first movement, for all of its oddness and for all of its eruptiveness and disruptiveness, these contrasts that seem to come out of nowhere, it has a purpose, and it's not going to get resolved until, you guessed it, that farewell finale. But we'll get to that in a moment. So next we have a slow movement, an andante, which is for muted violins, muted strings, basically, with woodwinds very carefully sketched in, very beautifully sketched in. And this movement is a wonderful emotional reaction to what we've just heard. Because what we just heard has been all violence and angst. But this movement, it doesn't know what it wants to do. It is a perfect emotional reaction. On the one hand, it's kind of numb. And on the other hand, it tends to get scary. It tends to head towards minor keys. It's major, then it's minor, then it's major, then it's minor. And it has some wonderful, wonderful, scary harmonies inside too. So you're not quite sure what feeling you're supposed to have after that first movement. You want to relax, you want it to be tranquil, but it doesn't let you go. It hasn't resolved the tension. That's the point. The tension of that opening movement. I'm going to play you the recapitulation of the second movement, just the part where it repeats the opening with some additional enrichments, and you'll hear exactly what I mean. Listen carefully to the difference between this casual simplicity and then its tendency to veer off into much, much more alarming and emotionally anguished bits. They don't stay there for long. It doesn't dwell on them, but it can't free itself of them either. And that's the point. So here it is. Oh, it's such an amazing movement. Just when the thing about that's so cool about it is that when it starts, you think, oh, after that first movement, this is so innocuous. It's just so it's just so unprepossessing, but listen to it and listen carefully, and you'll hear that the ghost of the first movement hovers over it all the time. And the same thing is true of the minuet, which comes third. The minuet is really kind of cool because it does a lot of the same things that the slow movement does. That is, it alternates very rapidly major key, major key, minor key. And the whole symphony, by the way, is in the same key. F sharp minor, F sharp major, basically. And the relative major, A major. It's in those that sequence of keys that are very closely related to each other, so that the whole thing has that sort of unity of expression and intensity. But I love this minuet. I'm not going to play the middle section of the trio, just the return of the minuet. And the fascinating thing about the minuet is it doesn't end. It's very disturbing. It just stops. It has this sort of throwaway phrase at the end of each section. Ya da 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 da. And it seems to end in the middle of a sentence. And not only that, that phrase which ends it in the middle of the sentence is yet another descending sort of arpeggiated phrase, quite similar to that of the opening of the whole symphony. So that, this idea of unity of melodic shape, of the direction that the tunes are headed, is something that Haydn is very, very careful to maintain as the symphony goes on. So now the middle section, I just want to make the point, the trio is a beautiful, beautiful passage for the two horns. And in Haydn's day, it was so unusual for horns to have to play an F sharp, which they have to in this central part of this trio, that he had to have special tubing made for the horns so that they could play in that key. Because in those days, horns didn't have valves. If you wanted to change the key the horn was in, you had to take the plumbing apart and put in new pipes. So he had crooks, they were called, in F sharp that you could insert into the horn so that it could play that music. In the other movements, the horns play in keys other than F sharp, just to have a certain number of notes available in the key of F sharp, because obviously, well, we don't have to get into the reason. They just do. Take my word for it. But we actually have the actual bill from Haydn to the metalsmith, telling the guy, you have to make crooks of this size so that we can have the horns play at F sharp. It had never been done before. Kind of fascinating little detail there. You can amaze your friends with your arcane knowledge of horn tunings in the classical period. Anyway, here is the minuet with that really, really surprising and abrupt ending. Yeah, isn't that cool? And sudden and sort of, again, oddly disturbing. And the whole point, of course, for it to sort of not really end is that we have to keep on listening. The whole point of these things is that one movement succeeds the other inexorably. You have to listen on to find out what's going to happen next. So then we get to the finale. And the finale is really two movements. It's two complete movements squished together that are run on, that are, one follows the other without a serious break. There is a pause. They're part of the same thing. And it really is astonishing, absolutely astonishing what happens. Now, the first part is what you might expect. It's a quick finale in the minor key, because that's what you expect in a finale, in a symphony that begins in F sharp minor. It's going to return to F sharp minor and probably end ultimately in F sharp major. But in this particular case, that's not exactly what's going to happen. But the interesting thing about this finale, or one of the billions of interesting things, is that it's very long. It works out to about 8 minutes in total. It's much the longest movement in the symphony. And that makes this one of the very, very first finale symphonies. In other words, a symphony where the weight of the argument is pushed off until the very, very end. So you need to hear what's going to happen at the very end. I mean, Haydn is leading us on to the expectation of some sort of amazing resolution. So that amazing resolution initially is a bit of a fake out. It is an entire F sharp minor movement that ends in F sharp minor. It's going to end where it's supposed to end. And it's about 3.5 minutes long, which is as long as most Haydn symphonic finales up to this point. And here it is. So the symphony could end there, but it doesn't. It doesn't. You have it simply pausing for a second, and then a whole other movement begins in a major key out of nowhere after a pause. Now, here's my point. Where did that happen originally? Right, you guessed it. The first movement, that weird second subject that no one can understand. Well, why does it happen in the development after a pause when it should be in the exposition? This is why. Because Haydn is toying with our expectations, and he's doing exactly the same thing that he did before. Seemingly, the music stops, it's full of angst and energy, a lyrical major key theme begins, and we would expect, because of the example of the first movement, that beautiful major key oasis would simply stop and the music would come back as ferocious as ever and it would end the whole thing in F sharp minor. But it doesn't. And that is the trick. That is how Haydn makes this piece such a musical miracle, because not only is this finale totally unexpected, it's not unprepared, even though what really happens is unexpected, but it has a logic. We feel the logic. And I'm going to play the entire farewell movement. And one of the tricky bits with everybody, when people first encounter this symphony, because, you don't see it. I mean, there's that visual element, unless you hear Hermann Scherchen's stereo recording, by the way, where he actually has the players get up and say, Auf Wiedersehen, and then you hear footsteps going away in the distance. That's really a very fun performance of the Farewell Symphony, I must say. Probably the most entertaining and perverse ever recorded. But no, the way Haydn organizes it is that the theme comes around a couple of times, and each instrument or group of instruments, in the case, like, for example, one horn and one oboe, they do their little solo, then they leave. Then it sort of comes around again, and then the other horn and oboe do their solo, and then they leave. And then the cellos leave, and then the double bass has a big solo, and they leave. And then all the extra violins, there are two solo violins, and then everyone else. And then the everyone else violins leave. The violas leave, and everybody leaves. The bassoon has its little doogie line, little teeny thingy, and then it leaves. So I am going to indicate, while we listen to this with little subtitles, who's leaving when, just so you get a sense of how the whole thing works. And then before you know it, there's just the two of them left, two muted solo violins to bring the symphony to a incredibly sweet, serene, nostalgic, touching conclusion. Really, just about the only thing that's comparable to this finale is the end of Poulenc's opera, The Dialogues of the Carmelites, where that whole convent of nuns gets beheaded one by one, singing a Salve Regina as they go until there's just one of them left, and then ka-chop. That's the end. It's a very, very similar effect, actually. You can compare the two if you want, just to see the musical effect of both finales, because that's what they are. So here then is the finale with the farewell bits indicated accordingly below. Who leaves and when? Incredible. I mean, if I were the prince, I would have told everyone to pack it in and go home too. Because what can you do after that? It is the ultimate finale. There can be nothing later. And it is a crime, by the way, in modern concerts when they do it as a first half piece. This is the end of the concert, this symphony. It must be the end of the concert. And it can be played with as many players as you need, because Haydn provides that I mean, you just double the parts and then, they go when they go. And, you can have more than one person leaving at the same time, because Haydn himself does that in his directions. You have a horn and an oboe going together, and you have a bunch of strings going together. So you don't have to do it with a teeny tiny orchestra. I think you should do it with everybody you can get your hands on and have them leave en masse at the end. If you're in a big hall, use a big ensemble. There's no reason to withhold the magic of this symphony from an audience just because you have to use a teeny tiny pint-sized orchestra, or out of some mistaken fidelity to some vision of authenticity. Just the music's going to work. It always works. It's foolproof in the way it works. So play it and keep on listening. And I have to tell you, when we come up with the next one, 46, nobody knows that symphony, but it's just as remarkable. Take care.